Thank you very much. This is a nice full house. What I was asked to do as well is just explain a little bit about where I work and how I got to be here. So I'm based here in the Centre for Tropical Medicine and Global Health in Oxford, and we have 3 overseas programmes, and we try and all work very closely together, and I hope some of this brings that together, because everybody conducts clinical trials and the wider spectrum of research, which I'll touch on a little bit. And I came into this from 10 years in industry, where I learnt my trade in designing trials, so I bring that into what we do here. But across the 3 overseas programmes and the work in Oxford, there's an awful lot of overlap here with the diseases I'm going to talk about and the trials that we've run. So, the World Health Report, the most recent World Health Report, which was from last year, published this year, we were so delighted to finally see, very clearly had a summary statement saying, unless we do more research, we're never going to really change the public health outcomes for the people in the most poorest regions in the world. And most importantly, that the people in those communities need to be the generators, not the recipients of that evidence. So it was a really strong call to say that research needs to happen in low and middle income countries, and it needs to be driven by those countries and generated in those countries. And it's no good just transferring evidence that was collected in Oxford or Washington or Paris and trying to extrapolate that to apply in low-income settings. And it's the strongest call I've ever seen in my career, and we're banding that around like mad, because it really shows that we should be doing more research where research doesn't happen, and that's essentially what I'm going to talk about now. I think most of you in the room, I recognise most of you, you know very well that hardly any research happens in these regions, and there's this 9-10 gap that people talk about quite a lot. And it's you've got 90% of the burden of disease, and you've got 10% of the funding. And we need all sorts of research. We need new drugs, we need new vaccines, but we also need much more pragmatic trials as well, and I'm going to talk about that as well. We need brand new treatments and therapies, but we also need to use existing drugs in different ways perhaps, and we also need to do things like evaluate different ways to train nurses or different ways to explore public health messages. So what's different about doing research out in these regions? Lots of my colleagues in the room will recognise these photographs. I took these when we were working on a malaria vaccine trial in Kenya, and malaria happens in the rains, and we had to move samples from the villages back to the lab, and this happens to the roads quite a lot. So when you're trying to move blood samples around and you've got a finite window to do some of the blood assays, you need to get those samples back, and it's quite tricky when the roads wash away. But often some of the work we do is much more different in terms of the risk and complexity as well. We do difficult trials in difficult places, and often the outputs are as simple as patient survival. I'll talk about Ebola at the end, and we're looking at who's alive on day 14. So, you know, that's a rare trial in the UK, and compared to most of the studies that are done, but that's the normal context in which we work. We also need big, simple trials. When you've heard in any of the talks over in the clinical trial unit with Richard Pito and co, they'll talk about big, simple trials where you've got a very simple thing you're measuring in lots and lots of people. There was a nice trial done in India a few years ago where they looked at treating pneumonia at home or in the hospital, and they had, I think it was 4,000 patients, very simple study, and they did much better at home than in hospital. I'll talk about fluid trials in a minute. These countries don't have much money to spend on healthcare as it is, so spending any money on research is a really tough call, and it's very hard to encourage countries to prioritise research, so that's a big disadvantage. And then you have the real issues of populations are hard to reach. Many of these countries are dangerous places to work, and the places where we really need to do research, it's almost impossible to access and sometimes isn't safe. We also need to increase research capacity, skills and training, not just in the healthcare workers in terms of their understanding about what research is and how to undertake research and give people the mandate to do it, but it's also in things like ability to review proposals in the ethics committees and scientific review, so it's quite a broad gap. Many of the trials that we run across the Oxford Tropical Network are in vulnerable populations, and these throw up an array of challenges that you can, I'm sure you can predict. Obviously children, we do a large proportion of studies in children actually, and that's, I've given lots of talks back here in the UK where there was, with all the changing EU rules about doing drug trials and drug registration and doing children's trials up front, our experience is quite unusual because historically other areas of the world, the studies in children followed later. So we're quite expert at running trials in very young children and in challenging settings. Often our participants are illiterate, and that can be obviously if it's in adults, but it's also illiterate parents when we're trying to consent the children, and that throws up difficult issues in making sure they are fully informed. And we have lots of creative approaches in making sure that there truly is informed consent and an understanding of what's being asked. Working with unconscious and seriously sick participants makes it very difficult, and we've got many approaches that we use there. And it's not just when you've got the participant that's sick, but then you've got distressed relatives in a very difficult situation, and even recently bereaved. And those are very challenging settings in any context, but working in those areas where you've got this big disparity between those doing the research and those who you're and the staff that are conducting it, it makes the imbalance even more difficult. Mental impairment, obviously this fact you're working with impoverished populations. Displaced people is another area where we need to do more research, and in fact most of the refugee camps and in war zones and famine and all these situations, you often wonder about the treatments and the policies that have been put into place. They're very rarely based on evidence, and there is a massive need to do research in those difficult contexts. But basically, it's people with a lack of autonomy. What you really need to be doing in all these situations is making sure people understand that you're trying to do research and explain what you're trying to do and have them understand that they've got the opportunity to say no. And so you think about it in that context and have what you've done and the way you've explained it, does it allow them to know that they've got a choice? So should we even include these groups? They're definitely underrepresented in research. And you know, it's just too much of a challenge, and is it unethical? And we spend a lot of time thinking through these issues, and there's huge activity with anthropologists and social scientists looking at many of these questions. But then, what type of studies do they need? Of course, we need new treatments, and they're the regulatory standard trials I'm going to talk about in a minute for new drugs and vaccines. There's also so much more probably that could be done with existing therapies. You know, maybe we could give antibiotics differently in maternal health to try and improve survival rates of the mothers and the babies. Vaccines is a massive area of research, and I'll talk to you about the malaria vaccine trial I worked on a few years ago, and we're trying rapidly now to get some Ebola vaccine trials set up. I'm sure you all know about the phase 1 trials that happened here, but there's a huge trial planned out in West Africa now for Ebola, and you know the challenges of working in that context are huge. There's not enough research done in post-mortem. These aren't clinical trials as such, but there is a need for taking samples and understanding what's happened, and it's really difficult to get permission to take samples or understand what's happened post-mortem. And then there's what we call disease management studies, and this is often using the clinical trial model, but it's doing things like assessing different ways to train health workers or to understand a health message, or perhaps introduce things like better hygiene practices. So you don't always need to use the clinical trial model to evaluate a very expensive new drug and vaccine. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of the studies that I've worked on over the last few years, just to show the spectrum of the things we get involved with. So the malaria vaccine trial was ran for sort of 7 or so years out in Africa, and involved a variety of different types of sites. Some were extremely experienced, like our programme in Khalifa you're going to hear about in a minute, and some were less experienced, but they all had the benefit of working in this public-private partnership for many years, and that trained up research staff and set this massive infrastructure in place in those sites to assess these vaccines. And children were randomised to receive the malaria vaccine or to receive a control, and were then followed up for quite a long period to see how many children got malaria, and obviously how many within those seasons, and if the vaccine gave a benefit for those children. And that was an amazing effort of running FDA standard clinical trials of a vaccine in Africa. And it was the biggest undertaking, and it was really successful and has left an amazing footprint of infrastructure for research. What will be great now is if all those sites could carry on doing clinical trials of other things and keep that capacity that they've got, and all those trained people so there's labs and pharmacists, data managers, the trial staff, which is the nurses, the field workers. There's a whole raft of people that have now got this amazing experience of working on a very sophisticated trial, and they could now put that in practice for looking at other questions in those sites. So that's a huge challenge now, whether that can be maintained and carry on. Just completely different to show you the spectrum of research we need. This is a group in Cameroon who again used the normal model of a clinical trial, but here they were looking at whether you could send text messages to people who are taking anti-HIV therapy, antiretrovirals, because it's quite a complicated set of drugs they have to take, and they need to adhere to them properly. They're often young men and maybe quite chaotic lives, but they've all got their mobile phone. So by sending them text messages to remind them what their therapy was, would that help them? Would they stick to their therapy, and would it help support them? So he simply randomised them to receive the text or didn't receive text. So nice use of digital technology, a very simple, inexpensive, pragmatic approach that uses a clinical trial, completely locally run, no need for a big expensive pharma company in the background, and a really nice study to look at a very straightforward question that could have a very significant impact. And then a completely different example again. This was a trial we ran a few years ago in East Africa, and again we took a mixture of sites here, some that were very experienced and some who'd never run any form of research before, and we were looking at fluid resuscitation. And so this is where children arrive in African hospitals, and they're unconscious, they're in shock, and at that point, on the shelves in the ward it says, here's what you do if they've got malaria, here's what you do if you've got pneumonia, here's what you do if there's sepsis. But these children would never have a diagnosis. They're just in shock and they need immediate intervention. And so the theory was to look at, if you give these children fluids, then it would improve the survival rate in the first few hours. Where at that point, 20% of these children were dying within the first 14 hours. So it was a really important question. What could you do right then and there without any diagnostics, without any sophisticated equipment? So these children were randomised to receive no extra fluids, saline or albumin. And this trial shows you why we do clinical trials. We were wrong. More children died on the active arm, and we had a data safety monitoring board to look at this. And we were doing more harm with the fluids. So the trial was stopped, and it was an incredible lesson in this is why you do trials. You ask difficult questions. You often don't get the answer you were expecting. And then, of course, there's been a long discussion ever since in the journals about, well, what evidence was all this based on anyway? Obviously, fluid resuscitation is common practice in standard care in Oxford and ITUs across the world, and we were assuming we could translate that to the settings which these trials were run. But this is why you run trials. You ask difficult questions and you don't always get the outcome you expected. But again, it was a very tightly run trial, very well organised, quite pragmatic in the settings we were working in, and it was we didn't have the outcome we expected, but a very important trial nonetheless. So what I've been trying to say is that we need to do many different types of trials in many different settings in all sorts of different populations. But having spent far too many years working on far too many trials in different places, what we all know, those of us who do it, it's actually we do the same thing again and again and again. And it doesn't matter really if you're doing an oncology trial in the JR or you're doing a fluid resuscitation trial in Tanzania. Most of the things we do are the same. And we have to go through the same steps and put the same pieces of paper together, put the same files together, train people in similar ways. And so most of these things are repeating again and again. And we obviously have to tweak them for the drug and the disease and the setting we're in. But they're largely the same. So if we got a bit better at swapping our protocols and our case record forms and all the paperwork we put together and learning from those trials, especially when they're in the same disease area or even in infectious disease or even if they're in children in Uganda where there are commonalities, we would speed it all up and we would raise standards because people share what works. So quite a few of us have spent the last few years thinking about this, and it's called community of practice. And you all use it all the time, I'm sure, because you all go on TripAdvisor to find out which is the best pub to go to in the evening, and you all share stuff on Facebook and go to YouTube to look at how to, I don't know, ice that cupcake. But we all do it, but we don't do it in science, because we've all been brought up not to share methods and knowledge and tools, because we fight for papers and we fight for grants. And you know, as researchers, we're not very good at sharing. But actually, if we did, we could speed up what we do. So a few years ago, we set something up called the Global Health Network, and it's basically a platform for people to share methods and knowledge to try and speed up research. I'll show you in a second, but there's different groups on there who run their own areas in their own topics, and then there's general areas where people can exchange more wider tools and resources and information. But the idea is it's a neutral democratic platform without any institutional or financial barriers. We've had over 300,000 people now visit the site, and we've had over 30,000 people take one of our online training courses. This is a slightly outdated slide now already. It moves too fast. But it's novel, because we're trying to apply all this cutting edge technology that we use with TripAdvisor and Wikipedia and so on, but applying it in the research context. And so we're funded by the Gates Foundation, and that pays for this really good digital technology and trying to make it work in this context. So we have all sorts of groups. We work in maternal health, and there's disease outbreaks and diagnostics, malaria, all these separate areas, and then they can come together on a central space to do things like online learning and exchange protocols and process maps and learn about how to do research. This is an example of one of our newest areas for neglected tropical diseases, where we're just trying to put everything up that's out there and get people to come together and talk about what they're doing and see if they can share things like data standards and dictionaries, so that when they do gather their data, it can be shared. So clinical trials are incredibly important, because we can't learn or improve or change what we do unless we gather evidence to guide us in what is the best intervention or a new health management or treatment practice. The low-income countries are drastically underrepresented in research, and at least finally the WHO's World Health Report recognised that and made that very strong call to make a difference. There are really very pertinent issues in these settings that must be considered, but that shouldn't be a barrier, and there's people are overcoming them, and again we should share how they are being overcome, because it does work. And thinking about the ethics and how we work with the communities really makes a difference. And all of those examples I've talked about today, we've worked with the communities from the outset and understood what they need to know about research and how that can influence the way we design trials. And what I always, when I train young doctors and nurses who maybe haven't been exposed to research before, and talk about the context of doing research rather than just clinical practice and how it adds to their careers, that it's great treating a patient and having that individual care, but when you run a trial and you do some research, the thing that you're doing is great for the participants and right there and then, but you're looking at influencing hundreds of thousands of people into the future, perhaps on that data, because it will be based on what you've done. So it's a really exciting opportunity, but a great privilege, but it means trials have to be run well and the data has to be accurate. So I'm just going to finish off with a mention of Ebola, and I'm happy to take questions on this. We were given a grant from the Wellcome Trust about a month ago to set up a platform for running clinical trials, treatment trials. And so we've all been frantically trying to do everything in parallel. It's quite incredible. We're writing the protocol, we're trying to get the drug sorted out, we're thinking about the SOPs. The team have been out in the region looking at the sites. We've been sorting out with Médecins Sans Frontières and the FDA and the drug companies. And it's just been an amazing exercise in trying to do everything in parallel. And we aim to try and get the study started by the end of November, which will be remarkable in terms of, it usually takes about 18 months, and we're looking at less than 3. We'll all be very grey and slightly stressed out if we do it, but we're absolutely determined to. There's huge issues. The most significant is there's absolutely no way we can randomise. So most clinical trials, obviously, you randomise to treatment A and treatment B, and what we would have done, if this was possible, was the patients are getting their standard of care, which is they're given IV fluids, antibiotics, antiemetics, multivitamins, and that's their supportive care they get. And then we're bringing in a treatment, so we would have randomised to giving standard care and standard care plus a drug. But you can imagine the tension at these sites and the reality of the situation. There's absolutely no way we could say, okay, you're A, you're B. and put the health staff in that situation. So we're not randomising, and we're going to use the same approach that's used in cancer trials, where we'll do an open study and everybody gets the drug, and we're using historical data as sort of historical control. So we're measuring mortality rates at day 14 and measuring against what we know is the situation already. And this is a perfectly eloquent approach that's used in similar situations where it's just not ethical to withhold treatment, really. And it's an adaptive design approach that we will keep analysing, and as soon as we see the mortality drop we are expecting, then we stop the trial. And this works when it's looking for a big drop. I mean, an RCT is a fantastic tool, and it's really good for looking at tiny differences, perhaps in resolution of pain or a small difference in therapeutic index. But here we're looking for a big drop in mortality, so it's perfectly acceptable to use this open single-arm approach. We've got lots of interventions that are lined up, and we will do one trial after another of a few things that are coming through. You can imagine the operational challenges and trying to look after the safety of the staff that are running the trials. And it's a big partnership. We're working with Médecins Sans Frontières, Institut Pasteur, our team in Oxford, all the groups out in the regions. So it's quite complicated. So that's just a brief introduction, and we will update. We can do regular seminars on this as it rolls out, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So thank you very much.